Hello, this is the EMOS course on Economic and Finance Statistics. My name is Nicola Massarelli and I work for Eurostat, where I deal with national accounts methodology. Today we start the course on national accounts. Before entering into the specificities of national accounts, this slide reminds us that this course is organized as a cooperation among different institutions. But what are national accounts and why are they so important? Quite often in the press or in the news you hear speaking about measures like GDP or GDP growth or household saving or investment, etc. These are all measures that are calculated on the basis of the national accounts framework. National accounts are thus a key component of macroeconomic statistics. The measures obtained through this framework are largely used for economic research and for policy making. These are therefore very important measures for users, be these policy users or researchers. This course aims at providing you with an overview of national accounts, but also some insights into practical aspects of compiling national accounts. This course on national accounts is structured in 9 modules. We will now start with an overview of national accounts to continue with a description of the economic actors and transactions. The third module looks at national accounts from the production side, while the fourth module will illustrate the expenditure approach to national accounts and the main elements of the supply and use framework. The fifth module touches upon the income approach to national accounts and we present the sequence of the accounts. The sixth module goes into the financial accounts and the government financial accounts. The seventh module will discuss price and volume measures in national accounts. The eighth module will illustrate the key elements for the compilation of quarterly national accounts. And finally, the last module will discuss the criticisms that are moved to national accounts and the challenges that national accountants face and are trying to address at the moment. Let's now enter into the world of national accounts. This slide shows the topics that we will cover together in this module. I will start with giving you a brief history of national accounts from its origins until the current system. I will then touch upon the relation between the international system of national accounts and its European implementation, the SNA and ESA. I will briefly touch upon the key features of national accounts. I will address the specific issue of revisions, that is a major issue for users of national accounts, and will briefly touch upon the main types of data sources that national accountants use to compile the accounts, among hundreds. On several of these elements you will find additional details in the following modules. So at this stage I will only provide you with a first overview. Before entering into the history of national accounts, let's first try to understand what are national accounts today. National accounts are a complete and consistent systems of accounts and balance sheets. They provide an integrated framework to describe an economy. As the name says, national accounts were born to describe national economies, but they can of course be used also to describe the economies of groups of countries, as it is the case, for instance, for the European Union. National accounts provide information to analyze the structure of the economies, but also their development over time. This is crucial. For instance, to know if an economy is going well, if its GDP is growing, or if it is doing less well, if GDP is slowing down or is shrinking, for instance. We hear very often this kind of comments in the economic press or news. There are two main characteristics of modern national accounts, and we'll see that it has not always been the case. The first key characteristic is consistent bookkeeping system. That is, the information that is included in the different parts of national accounts has to be consistent. The system is such that all the different parts have to match with each other. And the second key element of national accounts is that it is based on macroeconomic theory. So the system is strictly intertwined with the economic theory that has been developed over time. As I mentioned, the two main characteristics of modern national accounts, that is the consistent bookkeeping system and the link between the national accounts framework and the macroeconomic theory, are the results of a long evolution. If we look at the history of national accounts, we can identify three periods of very, very different length. Early attempts to compile national accounts data started already in the 17th century and lasted for many, many years. And this period stretches over several centuries, lasting until after the end of the First World War. Second period is much shorter, but it's very significant as it marks a consistent advancement in the national accounts. And this is why it is labeled in this slide the revolutionary decades. It's the period between 1930s and the period between the two world wars. And modern national accounts are quite recent indeed. This is the era of international guidelines that only starts after the end of the Second World War. So we will look at the history of national accounts from the perspective of these three periods. As I said, the first attempts to capture the economy in a single measure happened in the 17th century. At that time, the kings of the main European countries were running several foreign wars, and they were interested in how many resources they could use for these wars. So these early attempts aimed at estimating the income and wealth that could serve as a basis for taxation. These early attempts, the most valuable ones, were carried out in England by Pétain King and in France by Boisguibert, Bourbon and Quesnay. They focused on estimating national income, as I said, looking in particular at the agricultural sector, that was the dominant industry at the time, at trade and at the financial credits of the aristocracy. These early attempts were ad hoc studies carried out by individual scholars and focusing on specific issues. Nevertheless, they were quite remarkable and introduced elements that have then been that are then used until now. For instance, Quesnay's Tableau économique, published in 1760, can be regarded as a precursor of input-output tables and sector accounts, while Young introduced the concept of value added soon after. And a few decades later, Lowe for the first time deflated national income, that is crucial for intertemporal comparisons of the estimates. In the 18th and 19th centuries, attempts to measure national income were then carried out in several additional countries. But it was only in 1886 that a country produced the first official government national income estimate, and this was Australia. And it took until 1925 before more countries followed and produced official government estimates. The early attempts were very important for the future development of national accounts. However, we can say that the birth of modern national accounts is located in the 30s and 40s of the 20th century. These are called the revolutionary decades because the system of national accounts made huge leap forward and actually started to be really shaped during these years. What gave a major push was the Great Depression that started in the US in the 30s and caused a lot of suffering, unemployment, loss of income and poverty, very diffuse among the population. As a response to the Great Depression, as you know, the Roosevelt administration launched the New Deal. That was a huge investment program financed by government borrowing. To support the New Deal, the Roosevelt administration thus needed data to track the impact of these measures on the economy and the society, to see if they were working, and also because they were called to justify this huge public spending. It was the first time that the state intervened so massively in the economy. The problem is that the Roosevelt administration found that data were lacking. They were incomplete, incoherent, using different definitions. So they were very frustrated by the data that they found. And for this reason, they tasked a team led by Simon Kuznets to construct a set of coherent and comprehensive national income accounts. Kuznets and his team of economists took all the possible sources, data sources that they found available, and from administrative records, for instance, or from surveys, and they created a conceptual structure in which all these different data could fit in. Trying to establish common definitions and a system that could be regularly updated. Of course, the effects of the Great Depression in the US spread across the world, so the issue was not only an American one. This led to the need to carry out similar exercises in other countries. And we can, for instance, mention Colin Clark, who carried out similar studies in the UK and Australia. His focus was on national and intertemporal comparisons of real income, and he introduced the concept of purchasing power parities. So the focus until then, in response to the Great Depression, had been on income, because the Great Depression had caused loss of income. But then the Second World War came, and the priorities of the politicians shifted towards production. They wanted to have information about what could be produced and what were the necessary inputs to produce the goods that were necessary in a war economy. And in this context, Wassily Leontiev, who later won the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his work, developed input-output tables that establish relations and show exactly the relations between goods and services that are necessary to produce other goods and services. At this stage, both the income and the production approach to national accounts had been developed. A further crucial contribution to the development of national accounts came from the publication of Keynes' general theory in 1936. As you know, the general theory presented a conceptual framework that looked at the economy not only from an income and production perspectives, but also from an expenditure perspective, describing how the resources are spent or saved. The general theory can be considered as having started the so-called macroeconomics. And there was a push to integrate this macroeconomic theory and the language of Keynes' general theory with the measurement of the economists. Practical work was carried out by Richard Stone and Ragnar Frisch. They were practical economists that work to integrate the different strands of production, expenditure, and income into a coherent conceptual system that could represent the Keynesian model as a whole. And they created an integrated system that in the end gave economists and policymakers a very practical and concrete tool to carry out their analysis. These years, it's also worth mentioning the work of Tim Bergen and Frisch, who for the first time built an econometric model that covered the whole national economy. The early attempts and the developments in the 30s and 40s of the 20th century had been carried out by economists. Some of them had tried to compare data for their countries with other countries, but the focus was mainly national economies. After the Second World War, international organizations became more prominent, and they took over the conceptual development of national account standards. So the bureaucrats stepped in. The United Nations, in particular, had a very specific issue. They needed to establish criteria for country contributions to the system, to the United States. And for this, they needed comparable data of how much countries could contribute. So this was a big incentive for them to establish first guidelines that were accepted and followed internationally by all member countries. In this regard, in 1947, the United Nations published a first report, the most remarkable part of which was an appendix produced by Stone, who for the first time provided a detailed national account system and international recommendations on national accounting. However, this report was not regarded as official UN guidelines, but just as a useful technical report. The first official international guidelines can be regarded as the ones produced by the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, that later on will develop into today's OECD, in 1951. This international organization was overseeing the implementation of the Marshall Plan, the post-war reconstruction plan in Europe. These guidelines were thus mainly addressed to European countries. The UN followed soon after in 1953 and released the first global guidelines on national accounts. The first set of international guidelines were rather simple, much simpler than Stone's system in the 1947 UN report. They only focused on annual data and on goods, so they excluded services. Since then, there have been successive iterations to update the international guidelines to include new user demands. So the system was gradually expanded, for instance, to include services or financial accounts. or the measurement of national accounts at the constant prices, when at a certain point the focus moved from estimating levels to estimating growth. And the demand came to have more frequent data than annual data that were considered structural and not sufficiently timely for economic policy, and so the development came of quarterly national accounts. After the publication of the first official standards in 1953, 3 more generations of national accounts guidelines have been released in 1968, 1993 and 2008. The standards are regularly updated to take into account the evolution of the economies and to reflect phenomena that gain importance over time. The updates may not seem very frequent, however, one should consider several elements. The first one is consistency over time. If we updated the standards too often, we would lose the possibility to compare data over time, because data at different moments in time would be produced with different rules. So we have to be very careful when we decide to change these rules. A second element to consider is that new phenomena that have a big impact on the economies do not happen very, very frequently. They only emerge every several years, and also at irregular intervals. So it's not possible to have a pre-established plan of updating the system of national accounts at regular intervals. And the third element to consider is very practical. Implementing new guidelines each time is very burdensome and resource demanding. To introduce new elements in the system requires finding new data sources, new methods, gaining expertise. So it's a huge investment that countries are asked to make, which may be difficult, especially for developing countries. Compared to the first edition in 1953, the size of the guidelines has hugely increased over time, and while the 1953 edition consisted only of a few pages, the 2008 edition is several hundred pages big. At the beginning, the development of the system of national accounts was undertaken by the United Nations. However, since 1993, this has become a joint project of 5 big international organizations, also including the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, the World Bank, and Eurostat. The current system, the 2008 SNA, is complete and comprehensive, and all industrialized countries follow it, although sometimes they introduce some national specificities. But one has to be aware that some developing countries still follow previous editions of the SNA. Now there are plans to update the SNA in 2025 to take into account new phenomena that have emerged in recent years, in particular related to globalization, digitalization, and well-being and sustainability. As you can see in the slide, alongside the international system of national accounts, there is also a European system of accounts, ESA. The first ESA guidelines were produced in 1970, and then they have been regularly updated together with the updates of the SNA. And this because ESA is fully aligned with the SNA, and it is a sort of European translation of the international guidelines that takes into account some European specificities and specific needs. I will tell you a bit more in a few minutes about the relation between the SNA and ESA. Despite the 2008 SNA is huge, it doesn't fully fulfill the needs of national accounts compilers or users. For this reason, over time, a number of reports, guidelines, or handbooks have been produced to add some conceptual and practical implementation guidelines on specific issues, on specific parts of the national account systems. A second element to consider is that users are often interested in elements that are not covered in the core accounts, in what is in the system. They want to know more about other phenomena. And for this reason, a number of satellite accounts, so-called satellite accounts, have been developed over time. These satellite accounts help users analyze specific sectors of the economy, going more in depth, or looking at the aspects that are outside the SNA and experimenting with new ideas. Examples of satellite accounts among many that have been developed over time include environment and ecosystem accounts, agriculture, forestry and fishing, distributional accounts, research and development and digitalization, and so on and so forth. A last element to consider, which is related to the expansions of the system, concerns the consistency between the national account standards with the standards for other statistical domains, for instance, the government and finance statistics, balance of payments, employments, population, etc., etc. All these domains should speak to each other and should therefore be as consistent as possible, using, for instance, common definitions and common concepts. These systems were developed at the beginning rather independently, but over time there has been an effort to increase their consistency. And indeed, this has remarkably increased over time. And the next step is to go from ensuring a high degree of consistency towards a real integration between the different macroeconomic standards.